welcome to another OCD Recovery Instagram Live. It might sound a little bit echoey here because today I'm in my bathroom to demonstrate contamination OCD. I want to talk a little bit about some of the compulsions in relation to contamination OCD that people do in bathrooms, around the shower and so on. And it's a subject that I've been meaning to cover for a while. That's why it's taken me a little bit of thinking to plan it. I'm sorry for the echo, because obviously I'm in a bathroom setting. So I'm going to go through some of the compulsions that people do, that even people without that contamination OCD do, that aren't aware that it's contamination OCD, or aren't aware that it can be harm OCD too. It can link to harm OCD. So I'm going to be talking a bit about that as well. But what I want to show is the extent that this becomes a problem. So for myself, around the age of 17, I developed contamination OCD very quickly in the space of about 3 to 4 days. And when I developed this, what happened was I went from a period of not doing pretty much any compulsions to doing 5 to 6 hours a day of compulsions, constantly using all the shower gel in my house, which was my parents' house at the time, going through tons and tons of bottles of shower gel and shampoo. It was linked to harm OCD, so it was telling me that if I didn't do the compulsion, I was hurting somebody else in a form of harm, okay? In a form of giving them a disease or something like that. So what I'm going to do today is show some of the compulsions that we do that we often aren't aware of. Then I'll go back out of this bathroom so it isn't echoey, but I want to cover these in here because I need to demonstrate them. Now, let me have a look at, the first thing I want to do is talk about with taps. So let me just flip this camera around 1 second. Right, so with this tap, what we tend to do here is it tends to be this. That is what people tend to do a lot of, checking if a tap's turned off because of fear of flooding the house, fear of damaging the house, fear of loss of value if, for example, you damage the house, an insurance claim, whatever, or it's just a general wanting to feel this sensation of tightness is completely on. So then often they will overdo the tap and really go over the top on how tight that tap is. If that's a screwing tap, that's going to be like tight and so tight. Family members will often say, God, why is that so tight? Because they don't understand the situation. And with these kind of taps, it will often be sort of just testing to check it's off. So that can be that, right. So that's what's going to happen with those, with contamination in relation to that. Now in relation to soap, let's use this. Right, in relation to soap, making sure that there's a consistency on your hands that feels really soapy. That's what people are doing. They're making sure that it's really soapy. And if it isn't, obviously they're going to keep washing their hands. It's bloody hot, actually. So they're going to keep washing their hands till that is completely gone. Now, the problem with that is that soapiness, depending on the soap you use, you're also going to build up the sensation of thinking that that soap is completely gone. So you're going to think you're going to keep having that texture. So even now, I can still feel like there's a texture of soap on there. I can still feel like that's on there, but it doesn't. It's just the water. It's just how the water is. But if with OCD, I could keep going. Okay, I need to get that all off. Now, once that's done, then the person will do that. Now they'll often do this. They'll want to soap the whole tap to make sure that tap is completely clean. Now that can also obviously involve how they've come about using this soap to use this tap. So they may have, not fearing contamination, they want to get the soap on the tap first, clean the tap, then clean the hands. Then there may be other checking components of how do they touch this before leaving without because if say this isn't their bathroom or something, then there's the extra responsibility component of have they made the surface dirty. Now they can obviously then get into the whole habit of checking the whole sink, the surface around the sink, everything. Now the other thing that's going to happen here with this washing hands situation is nails. What people will do is often try and clean all their nails and then look for a nail brush. So look afterwards for a nail brush to clean all of their nails. I'm going to flip this round now and actually go into the other room so it's not too echoey, so I can speak about this bit. So what they will then do is they will then be looking to, but I need to do another Contamination OCD demonstration of a compulsion here, so I won't go out just yet. But basically then what happens is they're then doing all their nails, so they're looking to clean all their nails to make sure there's nothing under their nails. That is specifically can also you get a cycle which becomes counterproductive here in relation to sexual harm related OCD. People that are then washing their fingers, the skin's breaking, they're then scared that they could have got an infection through their fingers or passed an infection to someone through a crack in their fingers. And then you've obviously got the problem with contamination and blood related things in terms of cut fingers and damaged fingers and so on from overwashing, and obviously you'll get that anyway, them washing so much that their hands get bloody and red raw. So they'll look for often trying to clean all in between their nails. Then, I was going to do a demonstration just then, but it's holding this camera whilst using the water. 1 second, it's actually alright if I do 1 minute. Because what I wanted to demonstrate was also this. 1 second. So, if I look in this bathroom, in this flat, there is mould in that crack of the marble in here. Now, you're going to get that in shower surfaces and so on. You're going to get that sometimes. Obviously, that can get cleaned out, but some of those are marks that have been there for a long time that have just sort of, it's very hard to clean that out. Now, in relation to that mould, you also then get fears of mould. So if you're, for example, maybe you're renting a flat that you've just moved into and it's got mould in it, and you are very concerned about breathing it in, that can also become a compulsion in showers. Breath holding. Breath holding is huge in relation to showers, whereby what happens is people get scared that they're breathing in some kind of mould with the hot water, and that's going into their lungs. So then they'll do breath holding. That's the same with COVID. People become obsessive about COVID are doing loads of breath holding exercise, sort of going into a supermarket, holding their breath because they don't want any to pass on or to take in COVID, which obviously the risk, it doesn't work like that, but that's what they're doing. And that is exactly the same for bathroom settings, wanting to make sure that there's no mould, that the shower's completely clean. Now, then again, that it can link to things that you see. So what will happen is you'll get into a position whereby what you can end up doing is you can end up starting to think that you can start thinking that just because you've seen something, just because you've seen some mould on something, that or anything, it can be a colour. So people can be just in a bathroom that it's not theirs, and then they can just see a colour and think, well, that colour means that this is dirty, or this is damaged, or this is going to give me some disease, or this is going to give me something. And then they get into that as well. So that can be on anything. It can be a liquid, it can be a colour, it can be in anything. And then they can photograph it, try and ask for reassurance what it was. And it seems complete madness when you don't understand it. But it's a very easy cycle for somebody to get into and get stuck in and get caught up in that cycle. It's so easy. Now, I wanted to also demonstrate, I had some other things that I wanted to do in here. I can't remember what they were now. I was going to do something with the shower. But the shower is more or less the same as the tap in relation to how they're going about it. You've got to start getting used to not screwing taps so tight. That's really important. If you're trying to screw taps extremely, extremely tight, that's going to be a real, it becomes so much of a compulsion, because then you can actually get up in the night, keep checking the taps off. You've got to move towards accepting, even if there was a flood, it wouldn't be the end of the world. You wouldn't probably lose your house. Nobody would die. But then even if it goes to they would die, we need to move often to accepting that too, because it will try and do that. It will try and latch to all these things. It will try and latch to everyone dying, the house burning down, electrical. That's a very, very popular one. I was going to cover that in here as well. If you've got bathroom plug sockets that are near the sink, people often feel, what if an electric razor, or what if something was plugged in there and then it went into the water, and then the brain will create those things in your head. So it will make it feel like the electric was there. So often when I used to go out of the house, it would think there was a pair of jeans on the floor that had a phone in or electrical device, there's water from the shower, that's going to cause a fire. So it will often do those. It will often link those together, especially for women with hair straighteners. What if I've set fire to the whole house? What if I'm responsible for killing everyone? All that kind of stuff it's going to latch to. It can latch to appearance for some people. What if they get water on their clothes, and then people see they've got water on their clothes, think they've maybe urinated themselves, think that they're sweating too much, all things to do with relating to shame and feeling rejected. Same with toothpaste on their clothes, looking like they're not looking after themselves, all that kind of stuff. I think it's very important to think about how quickly certain OCD compulsions can grab a hold when we're not even realizing that they're about to do that. A lot of the breath holding ones start very quickly. I noticed the breath holding one started for me in a situation that had never bothered me for years. When I was younger, 16, 17 and 18, I used to use spray paint a lot, and when I was doing that, I never had any problem about getting a damaged brain. But then years later, I was using some I was using some Brasso on a letterbox, and I was cleaning it, and then I was thinking, wait a minute, what has that damaged my brain? And then I got into the breath holding compulsion and doing the breath holding compulsion over and over and over. And that became a problem because it can link into anything, and it causes so many problems for people without them realizing how quickly that breath holding just gets a hook and becomes a new cycle. And you really do think at this time, I must be going absolutely mad to have ended up with this breath holding situation. Now let me try, I was trying to just, whilst I'm in here covering this, I'm just trying to think if there was anything else that I wanted to cover, because you do have to think about these things, because what happens is, well, let's have a look in these comments first at Q&A, because people have probably asked a question about these things, so I will cover them. If there's anything you want covered here in relation to contamination OCD, let me know, and I will try and demonstrate it in here whilst I'm doing this Instagram live. Okay, let's have a look. No questions so far, but it's because contamination OCD, often what happens as well is with different themes. It's like I was speaking to Nick the other day, who on the channel covers all the sensory motor stuff, and I was saying to Nick, he said to me, he said, Rob, why don't you run a lot more sensory motor webinars? And I said, well, because although it's it's common with OCD. There's not as many people who, for example, who have ROCD, or it's a lot more common. I mean, ROCD is the most popular theme. ROCD is the most popular theme, and so then you've got like POCD, again, one of the most popular themes. So obviously we put them on in relation to the number of people that are coming. And in relation to contamination OCD, it's very popular, and people often think it's the most popular OCD, the most popular OCD theme, but it isn't. It's common in terms of people being stuck with it and doctors knowing what it's about. But online, more commonly, are the ones to do with thoughts, just because the medical system does tend to have a good understanding often of exposures in relation to contamination OCD. So they are able to treat that with exposures pretty well, but it's the ones like POCD, harm OCD, ROCD, and all of this stuff that they know very, very little about, and so hence why we cover that so much, because people feel so lost and hopeless with it. But that's not to say that contamination OCD leads to recovery, because if it's linked, which it usually always does, to harm OCD or anything like that, then they feel they're stuck in a wilderness usually, because they can't understand how they are going to get under that. Okay, I'm going to go into the other room and set up to do a question and answers in OCD in general, so I will be back in just a moment. Welcome back to today's Instagram Live on Contamination OCD. I will carry on where I just left off. So, with Contamination OCD, it's going to specifically link to, with all OCD, it's trying to form a bond between what your worst fear is, or not necessarily worst fear. So with contamination, but it tends to go to the worst case scenario, but not always. With contamination OCD, for example, it can latch to a feeling of feeling off, disgusting, a sensation that you really dislike, a sensation relating to an old memory that you really dislike. You then get sort of this kind of thought-action fusion contamination OCD, where if I don't do this, then it's linked to an old thought sensation from the past. So these things can get to an average doctor or therapist who's not got an in-depth understanding of OCD in general, but contamination OCD specifically is that area we're talking about. What tends to happen is that the fear is they are focusing on it from a point of, do the exposure, get used to whatever sensation's there and move on, which is the typical sort of ERP-based method. The problem is with that is when there's other fears latched behind the scenes, even if they're trying to get comfortable with the sensation doesn't release, because the sensation is latched into things in their thinking which aren't going to go just because you're getting comfortable with the sensation. So let's look at contamination OCD. Obviously, it can be latched to a feeling of sort of yuck, disgusting. So that could relate to feeling if they're dirty, or the belief they're dirty even though they're clean, that they're disgusting, yucky, feel wrong being around people, and that becomes a cycle in itself. Then it could be that, and this is one that's a little bit more complex, that is often not spoken about, but on this channel we try and cover all the aspects of OCD that don't get covered. It could be linked sometimes to people could have a feeling like maybe they had a trauma in the past. This is not a trauma in the present in relation to what they're thinking, but in relation to a trauma in the past that they're over. So they may have been sexually abused or something in the past. They had a sensation from that they then thought there was the thought-action fusion that's linked to feelings of cleanliness, and that becomes a problem. That is not something where there's a trauma now and they need to go and do loads of investigation into the past. It is, yes, just a sensation-based, but they need to have a little bit of an understanding of why that sensation's there and how that's working. Now, that is much rarer. That is, obviously, OCD sufferer goes, oh, that's maybe me, and that's it. No, it presents pretty clearly as them saying, oh, yeah, this is linked to a feeling from the past, and this is latched in this way. Much rarer, not usually the case, although all OCD sufferers will then think that's the case. But in that case, it is getting comfortable with the sensation and understanding why they had that reaction at the time, and understanding why this new reaction that they're having, this new rational karma reaction, is actually genuine and is actually not irrational and a sort of leap out of the ballpark in irrationality. So they can understand what they're doing there in that process. So there's that. I will cover thought, action, fusion, all these kind of elements in a separate Instagram live, because it's quite complex and there's quite a lot of components. Usually quite uncommon, but that one does need covering. Now, also the most common, which was the one for me specifically, was harm-related OCD. Now, this can be harm relating to if I don't clean and pass on a disease to someone, then I'm guilty. Especially in the COVID pandemic, that's become a situation of, if I don't do this, then this could give my mum COVID or whatever. So then there's this obsession with trying to make sure they're completely clean within a certain boundary range that they've set, an imaginary boundary range of safety. Okay, so let me give you an example. as well with all this. I was just talking just now, as you saw on that in the bathroom, about washing my hands. Now, I've just washed my hands with that soap, doing the exposure, and I can feel my hands are really dry now, really, really dry. But during that period with contamination OCD, no sensation in the hands OCD could hijack. It will just tell you, no, the hands are dirty all the time, infection, passing on a disease. That can be anything. That can be linked to anything that the individual is scared of. So they may be scared of passing on bodily fluids. They may be scared on passing on blood, sexual fluids, anything that they can do that. And then they will be obsessively, compulsively trying to prevent that from happening, to ensure that they keep within these parameters of safety which they've outlined in their head. Now, what all of this involves is you've got the harm, you've got there's the yuckiness feeling, there's the general misunderstanding of cleanliness, of I need to be this level of clean to be content, to be safe, and so on. And that can develop through different beliefs that they've held or families held and so on, and that's come into course. Exposures obviously gets under the whole compulsive element, so breaking all that down. Then the internal sensations and understanding why they're doing it is the next part where we have to look at it rationally, because often they will have done a lot of ERP, cut all that out, but still feel a yucky feeling, a disgusting feeling, an anxious feeling, a chronic guilt feeling. And we need to get into that to look at that and to break down why that isn't what they think it is. And so that's very, very key. Now, contamination OCD has various other elements to it that often go missed in the OCD community. A lot of these people, they have so many other things that people don't even know about. A lot of OCD sufferers don't know. Like people be for example, holding going to the toilet, so then they can often cause problems in their internal organs because they're resisting going to urinate because they're so scared of using a public toilet, or they're so scared of passing on infection, harming someone, and so on. Or they may be scared about getting water on them and other people seeing that. That can happen. These cases can cause a huge amount of damage. Like with anorexia, with anorexia can cause damage to the body from not eating. Not going to the bathroom can do damage as well. And so this can become a thing. Now, it can also latch. So for myself with contamination OCD, it only predominantly latched to it wasn't much of my OCD journey, but it was very intense for a short period of time. It was relating to harm OCD, passing on something at about 17 to 19 years old, during those periods for months, not for years. And just very quickly getting out of hand. But the tightening of taps can carried on for maybe 10 years because I just thought, oh, that's not that big a deal, in relation to the same with cookers and checking the gases off. Those were the same until I viewed it like a drug that I was trying to quit, and so cutting all those out. And it always tries to get its way back in with those if you don't watch that. Now, where was I? I was talking about with using the bathroom. What happens with those things is then people then start to avoid that. They start to avoid using the bathroom, and then they can have sensations that this can all link into. What if they don't know when they're going to use the bathroom? The response to go and urinate is they don't know. So what happens if they wet themselves and these kind of things? Then they sit in a restaurant making sure that they're in a position where that won't happen. Now, all those situations again become more compulsive in their own ways. And when I suffered from contamination OCD, I knew what was going on. I knew it really felt life and death, so I was very much stuck in that. But I didn't understand all these other elements till a lot later on in the journey. And I mean, obviously, I've been working with OCD for a very long time, and I see all different scenarios of OCD every day. So you see a whole range of things, and things that I never thought were how OCD could latch in there, but it does in so many different ways. And so the ones in relation to people fear of urinating, that can link into other things. Maybe they had a disease, or maybe they had a medication that the doctor said to them, on this particular medication or in this particular situation, you could get into a position where you may not know when you need to urinate, or you may urinate too much, or whatever, and then it can link into health OCD, of colour of it, in case you've got a disease and so on, all these kinds of things. But then they all overlap and interlink. It's like I always say, OCD is like a web that's all intertwined. And so what will happen then is
they will often want to avoid using the bathroom too often, only want to use the bathroom in their own house, have a set routine of how it all needs to be cleaned down and perfect, and everything needs to be in a specific formula. Then they have often, then their partner's often helping with the rituals to make sure it's set. The bathroom's probably been made in cases where it's gone further with the compulsions. They may be spraying down the whole bathroom in a special format to make sure everything's specifically clean, so that they're out of that situation, and if anything breaks that cycle, then they get very anxious. There's a whole mixture of things. Now, contamination OCD, let's break it down, because if someone didn't have OCD and they were listening to this video, they would think, God, that's so strange, that's so weird, how the hell does that happen? God, they must be very weak or nervous to have that. Well, yes, it can appear like that, but let's demonstrate why it isn't. If you ever think when you're anxious, say you're sitting on a chair, you nearly fall back, and then you think, oh God, I leant too far. Right. Well, imagine that sensation, but it's latched to cleanliness. So you're doing something's happened, and then you're like, God, I need to correct that with cleanliness. Well, then the body has got into a cycle of trying to correct a sensation in the brain with a cleanliness ritual. So you've set up an anxious cycle. So imagine just like a sort of electricity in the brain, anxiety. You've set up that cycle, and then you're trying to turn that off using an external compulsion. And you get a momentary relief in that anxiety that electricity being switched off for a brief period of time, and then switch back on again when it sees another way around the way you just switched it off. And that's where reassurance works initially, and people think this is great, to when reassurance doesn't work, and then we get a cycle and a cycle and a cycle, and it builds and builds and builds and builds and builds. Okay, so that's what's going to happen. I think what really you need to think about when thinking of contamination OCD is whatever you are doing externally, it's only from the internal in the brain. So you're trying to change your external environment to calm a sensation in the brain. Nothing needs to be done externally to fix the internal. We have created that link by how our beliefs initially were related to the external. So when we changed them, it turned it down or off. So therefore, we got into that cycle of keeping that going. So we need to be very vigilant of that, in not a way that we are being extra cautious, because that's the last thing we're doing, but being aware of OCD's intrusion, where OCD is trying to make us change the external, and resisting that, getting comfortable with the sensation, whatever it is, whether it's what if I harm my family, whether I die, what if my house burns down, whatever. And that's where the unconditional self, life, and other acceptance comes in, because it gets under those parts to help with turning off that plugged in electricity like cycle in the brain, which is anxiety. So you get that. Now, let's have a look here. I will demonstrate this in the kitchen as well. 1 second. Let's have a look. It's not a very good demonstration, but I was going to demonstrate with another thing that people get contamination OCD is in relation to food and in relation to cleaning products. If people have a spray for cleaning and there's fruit around, what if a bit went on it and then I give that fruit to someone and then they die, or it's my responsibility? And then often one of the most common ones is it's all to do with fear cycle, never getting out of it. So it's, what if I can't remember what I did and then say stuck forever or stay anxious forever because I did something? What if I can't remember what I did and then I get stuck in the loop? What if I forget my compulsions or my compulsions go wrong and then I stay stuck in the loop forever? All of that. So there's a lot of that fear cycle, staying in that cycle. Now, this can obviously relate to any particular thing in relation to contamination. It can relate to getting spray contaminated with some kind of liquid cleaning product. It can turn up the heat on things where it's more risk, a product for maybe killing insects, or a strong cleaning chemical, or very strong cleaning chemicals for commercial stuff that's then latched to, or asbestos getting connected to. What if that comes to me or to someone else or whatever? And that's a good example of one where it can latch to visual sensations. What if I see a white mark? Maybe that was asbestos, maybe that was dust, maybe that was, and so on. So it's got various areas that contamination OCD can link into. And it can happen in any situation. So somebody may be working with their father in a garden or something, and then they give them a particular product for killing insects, and their dad says to them, not when they're young, I'm talking about in their normal, in their life now, not of past memory, but it could be something in the past, but it's not bothering them today. But maybe how it developed a little bit is they said, okay, just be careful with this product. Not in a bad way. They just said, be careful with this product because it can cause harm. Or maybe if you get this on your skin, it can harm you. And then that extra went into overdrive in the brain. So being very cautious of those things and then setting up a cycle. Maybe someone works in a laboratory and then they're very scared of certain chemicals they're around coming home with them. Or maybe in the COVID situation, what if they do things to lead to an outbreak or something like that. So there's various areas it can get into in relation to contamination OCD. It could be in relation to allergies in a restaurant. What if you touch nuts, then touch someone's food or touch them or anything like that? It tends to lead to a sort of very focused visually on things around you to make sure that your contamination barriers are not crossed. So for example, if you are very scared of asbestos, for example, you may be looking for asbestos in every building you enter, asking somebody, has this place had asbestos? How old is this building? Looking for dust in things, looking for dust in skips. If there is a lot of dust from building work, maybe that's asbestos coming into the lungs. Maybe I was around it. And it can start maybe from someone saying there was asbestos here, or we had to redo this house because of asbestos, or whatever. Those things can start in those ways. Other areas of contamination could be, I'm just trying to think, dust related. It could end up to cause infections or problems or anything like that. It can be linked to that. It can be linked to, are you breathing that in? Mold, as I covered earlier, which is a big one for a lot of people. People worry about getting infections of the lungs from mold. What other things? Rust, tetanus, that's another one. What if I cut myself and then got tetanus from it? Do I need to go to the doctor? Rabies can be another. That's a health OCD one, but then trying to assess different animals if they look like, or did anyone know if they could be rabies, especially if they're going to countries where that's prominent. Cats, cat scratches. What if they get a cat scratch? How do they know? That can be health OCD, but it can also link into contamination OCD in terms of being careful around that to avoid that. Then checking and making sure that everything hasn't had a cat there or something like that. They can all cross over and intertwine. Now, let's have a look if there's any specific questions in relation to contamination OCD, because that's the topic of conversation today, and I don't want to go off topic, which I usually do. Violent sexual related OCD, you can check on our YouTube channel in the playlists in relation to harm OCD. We cover that extensively in there. There's a couple of reassurance questions there that I'm not going to answer. One of my biggest themes at the moment has to do with being a whole foods healthy vegan. I'm worried and afraid of starting ERP and suddenly deciding not to be vegan. Yes, it can often latch to this. This is very much the case with health OCD and harm-related OCD, because what happens is you get a situation whereby you... I used to get it in restaurants with, I'm not a vegetarian, and I used to, a certain meat that I thought may have been slaughtered in a way that was far worse than the normal way. It would be, would trigger harm OCD. Now, I know vegetarians will then say, yes, you should be triggered by that and so on, but I'm talking about in the context of people who are already eating meat, where OCD has infiltrated and is getting them to then start avoiding all the other things in an OCD-like fashion, not because of their own view on eating meat. And that's the same here with that. But yours is more to do with in relation to your values, in relation to being vegan and wanting to recover and not wanting to lose that. So it's attacking that, whereas it's not going to do anything to do with that. It just knows that you're scared of losing that because that's want something that you value. So you do the ERP. It's not going to change your beliefs. You don't get people to do ERP and then give up their religion or whatever. It doesn't work like that. But it tries to attack the OCD journey too. I'm also suffering from religious OCD, yes. Contamination OCD in relation to vegan food, yes, it can do things like, it can link to what if there was meat in there, what if I ate meat and then kissed a vegan or something. That is actually a very common one, and you laugh at how ridiculous the things it comes up with, but it does. It can link a harm element there, especially with a partner where one may be vegan, one may not, and even if they have no problem with that situation, it can create all of those things. Oh, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I still had a bit of meat in my mouth or something like that. It does all of those things. Advice for living with flatmates and having contamination OCD. Well, you've got to try and fit in as best you can with the flatmates. They have an understanding of your OCD, but they're not going to always be the most compassionate. It often is good because it gives you a sort of kick to move in the right direction to sort of fit in with that, which is good, rather than keeping all these compulsions going for years and avoiding that. So it's often good for that. But explaining you've got OCD, so there's a bit of a compassionate element. Whether they give it to you or not is another thing. Hopefully so. But it helps usually with keeping the structure, because you can't often you have to keep going within a sort of normal realms of life. And so it keeps things in play in a better way than people who've got a family that are all sort of doing all their compulsions, helping them, which is the worst situation, because then it just grows like a goldfish, bigger and bigger to the surroundings it's in. Guys, great to have you all here. I'll be back on another Instagram live soon covering other topics on OCD, but I just wanted to cover contamination OCD as it's a topic that, although it's common, like I said earlier, it doesn't always get covered properly. So that is what I wanted to do today, and I hope I did that. Guys, great to see you here, and I will see you on the next Instagram Live. Take it easy.